So good morning. Yes, my name is Dan Pollock. I'm glad to know I'm in the cold and competent bit. We will see if I drop to the, I think, disgust and pity bit at the end of this, but fingers crossed we don't do it. So I've been asked to talk to you, share a bit of data about the open access market. So we'll have a look at how it's changing, so what. Just before I start, the compulsory word from your sponsors. So for those of you who don't know Delta Think, we're a consulting firm. We work with organizations across the scholarly communication space. And really what we try and do is help people understand and thrive in our ever-changing landscape. And we try and take a kind of neutral, independent point of view. And then a brief introduction to the data. We've gathered quite a bit of data looking at market trends in scholarly publishing over the last, we've accumulated that data over the last 7 years, although it does go back before that. And we're going to focus on the bit about open access, because that's the focus. It's a wider data set. We don't have a lot of time, so if you've got any questions about it, I'll be here for both days and happy to dive into methods and things like that. So how much open access is there? The headline is we think about half of it. So we think by the end of this year, roughly half of what we term core journals output will be published free of charge to read and free to reuse, give or take some restrictions around sort of CC licenses. But that headline masks some very important nuances. So I'm going to ask the same question again, but let's go back a few years and ask the same question 2019. How much open access was there in 2019? And we can find data points, credible data points, that will put it somewhere between 10% and over 53% of it. So the 10% comes from a recently published policy update from the Open Scholarship Initiative, and that's looking at proportion of articles and reviews that are published in fully open access journals under CC BY licenses. So think kind of quote Plan S, that kind of thing. The 53% comes from a tweet from one of the On Paywall team, put out 2 or 3 years ago, and they're basically covering anything with a DOI that's legitimately outside of paywall. And so the point is, when we ask how much stuff there is and we start to look at the data, it very much depends on the context of the people giving it, and what it means for you will depend on where you are in the scholarly publishing landscape. So the short answer is there's no short answer. So by way of an example, I want to go back to 2023. So here we go. Here's our scholarly output. Here's our headline, roughly 50% of it. And what I've tried to do is pick some examples that might illustrate the underlying trends. So imagine, if you will, there's something called Dan's Institute of Physics. Hello. Physicists amongst you will be relieved that there's no such thing really, but just by way of an example, if we were advising Dan's Institute of Physics, we'd say, well, actually, from their perspective in the physical sciences, around about 40% of output is open access. And if you drill from physical sciences into physics, then about 40% of output is open access. But if you drill into physics itself, almost 90% of papers in high-energy particle physics are open access, compared with barely 15% of papers in, let's say, condensed matter. So again, lots of nuance there. And if we then further dive into how that open access piece breaks out, we find maybe roughly 3/4 of output in physical sciences and physics is open access, it's in fully open journals, compared with the rest in hybrid. But that most of high-energy physics is appearing in fully open journals. Probably hardly surprising, scope 3, etc. But then if you look at our condensed matter physics example, it's roughly 50-50. Okay, so lots of nuance. And then, of course, when we think about open at scale, we need to think about how much stuff, as well as what share there is. So let's dive into physics, because I'm advising Dan's Institute of Physics. We'll squash that uptake within each subject to the left, and then we'll look at how much stuff is being published. And what we see is that particle and high-energy physics, it actually accounts for a very small share of physics output. So a lot of uptake of open access, but actually sort of very little, if you will, influence in quotes in terms of the overall market. But our condensed matter physics, much lower uptake, but it publishes almost a fifth of physics output. So the interesting thing is that although the yellow bit, the fully open bit at the left for condensed matter physics is much smaller than for high energy, in actual fact, there's many, many more papers under there. And I picked these examples because I think these are quite typical of the kind of dynamics you see when you dive into the data. You can get real headlines, gee, there's lots of stuff, but it may in actual fact move the overall needle only a little bit. Now, so far we've been looking at a static snapshot, 1 year. But we also need to ask, how is this changing? We want to get into open at scale. So I'll ask the question, how much did open access output grow in 2023? And we think roughly 15% per year. But again, those headlines mask a nuance. And this time, the nuance is in the timing of when you take the data. If you want to understand how things scale, there's some subtlety there about when you actually take your readings. So let's go back to the end of 2021. We'll ask the same question again, and this time, how fast did fully open access output grow in the year just ended, 2020? 26%. I wish my pension pot was doing that. I mean, that's a good number, right? However, now that number again is a credible number. It's from a piece that was put out in the Scholarly Kitchen. After that piece was published, what happened was that a number of papers that were published online in 2020 had their publication year reclassified to 2021 when the print editions came out. That had the effect of reducing the number of papers that were, quote, published in 2020, and they then became, quote, published in 2021. And that meant the Scholarly Kitchen piece had to be reissued, and that growth figure dropped, simply because of the timing of when those readings were taken. So I'm not criticizing the Scholarly Kitchen, this is about the underlying data. So when we think about how is open access changing, and we do our market research, the first thing we have to do is wait. We have to wait till about halfway into the year before the data sources will settle down. Then we have to acknowledge that if you look at how fast, in this case, fully open access is growing from year to year, you'll see the growth is coming in fits and starts over time. So to understand the trends, we actually have to smooth out those curves for underlying trends, because we want to get people a kind of meaningful direction. We don't want to give you false headlines of saying, oh, it might be suddenly shooting up or shooting down. But equally, we also have to recognize sometimes those trends are genuinely showing a little bit of lumpiness, technical word, because there may be events such as COVID-19 that come along and make a difference. So if we go back to advising Dan's Institute of Physics of how uptake in open access is changing, put all those trends into it, what we see is that in high energy physics, in actual fact, it's pretty well flat. So I suggest that having hit 88, 90%, we've probably hit some sort of saturation in that output, and the amount of open access uptake is not changing. But there we go, condensed matter physics at the bottom, well, the share of open is continuing to grow. And again, remember, there's way more papers in that bottom line, so the chances are that growth is going to move the needle more. So overall, when I was asked to share some data about how much open access there is and how is it changing, it's a complicated connection of various different factors. And that in practice, when we try and dive into what this means, we have to scale those factors out across different subjects, across different access types. So we focus on open access here, but you'll notice there's gray bars. We also look at the not open access piece. So for example, if Dan's Institute of Physics wanted to know, how will the Nelson memo affect me? We'd have to do this kind of modeling, and then we'd typically present our results in some sort of grid and color it in, typically as a heat map. I thought of showing colors on this, but then people would say, what do they mean? But the point is, you need to model this across everything. But I hope I've shown you just some interesting examples that capture the general trends. So what does all this mean? Well, as I said, your mileage may vary, but I think there are some interesting overall patterns that are emerging. So with the caveat that we're looking at averages and thinking about how open access is scaling, if we look at the average size of journals, so how many papers are published per journal per year on average, I think it's notable that open access only publishers on the right are tending to publish much larger journals, 4 to 5 times larger than mixed model publishers on the left. There's a gray bar just to the right of the blue one that's not open access, that it's not really coming through on the slides. But the thing I find notable is that, of course, open access only publishers publish fully open journals. the fully open journals from mixed model publishers seem to be following their other stuff. So the data seems to be telling us that open access only publishers are approaching the marketplace in a different way. They are scaling in a different way to mixed model publishers. That hasn't always been the case. So if you go back a few years, both publishers were basically publishing the same size journals, but as open access publishers have really dug in, they seem to be scaling the size of their journals in a way that other publishers aren't. And at the same time, open access only publishers appear to be taking market share. So they're probably now accounting for around about a fifth of overall output. And what that means, if you combine this chart with the previous one, I think open access only publishers are gaining more share with, if you like, proportionately fewer journals, whereas mixed model publishers are creating more and more and more titles to defend their market share position. So we're seeing, I think, a difference in dynamics between how open access is scaling and how other publishing output is scaling. And I suggest that's simply reflective of the economics of open. So if we go back to our share of output, and we've been talking about output so far, there we go, roughly half of it, that accounts for barely 1/5 of the money changing hands in the market. So if I put my neutral consultant's hat on, what that means is you could argue that open access publishing is, quote, less lucrative if you're selling or more cost effective if you're buying. I pass no judgment. Please don't treat me with disgust and pity. My job, my job is to be the tour guide. But the interesting thing to note when we look at the economics of it is, okay, that small proportion of revenue for open access is having a significant effect. So if you look in the growth in the value of the overall market, we think around at least half of the growth in the overall market is being driven by that growth in open access value. We think that's happening across the board. So, you know, large publishers or small, that seems to be where the economics is taking us. And then just one final thing on economics. We think we're seeing evidence of more price elasticity in the open market. So here what we're doing, each blob is a publisher, and then we're plotting each publisher's average APC, average article processing charge vertically, against an average measure of impact. I'm sorry, Josh, other measures of impact are available, and it's not a Clarivate number. The blue circles, the ones at the top, or I think they're coming out more turquoise, they are hybrid journals. So what we're seeing is that, on average, publishers appear to be just setting an APC that's fairly constant. I suggest that probably reflective of the economics of sort of non-open access publishing. Whereas the yellow blobs, fully open journals, there seems to be a relationship between price being asked and average measures of impact. So some evidence of price elasticity, again, in those fully open journals. So I hope I've given you a whistle-stop tour, a little bit of data, looking at how much is there, how's it changing, so what. I've tried to pick some fairly typical examples of those issues of, you know, high uptake might have low output, those sorts of things that I think are quite common patterns. But in conclusion, I'd say we're very much looking at a market in transition. But what that means for you, how that will affect you, is very much going to be determined by where you are in the scholarly publishing landscape. With that, I'm going to hand over to Josh, and I know there'll be questions after Josh has finished speaking, so thank you very much.